The tape on Sophie's violin caught the harsh stage lights as laughter rippled through the auditorium. She stood frozen, a janitor's daughter summoned as a cruel joke by teachers who'd never bothered to see her. The worn-out shoes, the second-hand dress, the way she clutched that battered instrument, it was all meant to entertain the wealthy parents and their privileged children. But then she played. One note, then another, each piercing the veil of prejudice hanging in the air. In the back row, reclusive billionaire Edward Chambers leaned forward, recognition dawning in his eyes, not just of extraordinary talent, but of something far more personal. The forgotten melody that now silenced the room was one he'd written himself, decades ago, for a man no one in this room would ever suspect. Sophie's father. Sophie Miller moved through the empty corridors of Lancaster Academy like a ghost, invisible by necessity. The janitor's daughter learned early that visibility brought only scorn at a school where tuition exceeded her father's yearly salary. She kept her eyes down as she passed marble busts of founders and benefactors, their cold gazes following her threadbare uniform and scuffed shoes, telltale signs of someone who didn't belong. The music room was her secret sanctuary after hours. While her father, James, mopped floors and emptied trash cans, Sophie would slip inside and listen to the lingering echoes of privilege, the phantom notes left behind by students who took their $10,000 violins and private lessons for granted. Sometimes, when she was certain no one was near, she would take out her own violin from its tattered case. It had been her grandmother's, this violin with its mismatched strings and chipped varnish, held together with carpenter's glue and electrical tape where the neck had once cracked. James had found it in an attic box after her death, the one good thing left from a life of hard work and harder losses. "You've got her hands," he told Sophie when she was 7, placing the instrument in her small grasp for the first time. "Made for music." His voice had carried an undertone she couldn't name then, something like reverence mixed with old pain. In the vast, empty music room with its perfect acoustics, Sophie played by ear and instinct. What she lacked in formal training, she compensated for with raw emotion and an uncanny ability to reproduce what she heard. YouTube tutorials on library computers became her teachers. Sheet music forgotten on stands became her textbooks. Meanwhile, across town in a steel and glass mansion overlooking the lake, Edward Chambers sat alone with a glass of scotch, surrounded by evidence of his billions. At 62, his tech empire had made him one of the richest men in the country, yet tonight, like most nights, emptiness echoed louder than any achievement. The invitation to Lancaster Academy's annual showcase sat unopened on his desk, another obligation to fulfill, another building named after him to visit. "They're expecting you to announce the new endowment," his assistant reminded him over the phone. "The press will be there." Edward grunted acknowledgement. These appearances had become perfunctory, calculated donations to maintain his public image while private bitterness calcified around a past he never discussed. Back at Lancaster, the day of the showcase arrived with a flurry of activity. Parents arrived in luxury vehicles, students in performance attire gathered nervously backstage, and teachers made last-minute preparations. Among them, Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, head of the music department, surveyed her domain with practiced authority, her pearls gleaming under the lights as she checked her list of performers. "Where's Melissa?" she demanded, noticing the absence of her star pupil. Her mother called something about food poisoning, her assistant replied. Eleanor's face tightened. "That's our closing performance gone." The Paganini piece was meant to impress Chambers before the donation announcement. Backstage, Sophie emptied trash bins, keeping to the shadows as she'd perfected over years. The excitement wasn't hers to share, yet she couldn't help drinking in the atmosphere, the nervous energy, the instruments being tuned, the hushed voices reviewing final measures. James worked methodically nearby, his weathered hands guiding the mop in practice strokes. At 58, decades of physical labor had bent his frame slightly, lines etching his once handsome face. Few would connect this unassuming maintenance worker to anything remarkable. Miller, Mrs. Harrington's voice cut through the bustle, addressing James without quite looking at him. "We need the stage left wing cleared immediately. Those cleaning supplies can't be visible during the performance." "Yes, ma'am," James replied with practiced neutrality, the same tone he'd used for 20 years of invisible service. That's when Mrs. Harrington spotted Sophie, standing too close to the performers, a violin case partially visible behind a trash bin. Her eyes narrowed. "What's that?" she asked sharply. Sophie froze. "Nothing, ma'am." "Show me," Eleanor demanded, extending her hand with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. With trembling hands, Sophie revealed her grandmother's violin. Several nearby students snickered. "You play?" Eleanor's tone made it less a question than an accusation. Before Sophie could answer, another teacher joined them, catching the tail end of the exchange. "The janitor's daughter?" he asked with barely concealed amusement. "Now that would be entertaining." Something cruel flickered in Eleanor's eyes, a solution to her problem wrapped in an opportunity for mockery. "Indeed it would," she agreed, a small smile forming. "In fact, I think we've found our replacement for the Paganini. Next, we have an unexpected addition to our program," Mrs. Harrington announced, her voice carrying a hint of anticipation that made Sophie's stomach clench as she stood in the wings. "Sophie Miller will perform for us." The audience response was muted confusion. Parents consulted their programs, finding no such name listed. Students exchanged glances, some already suppressing laughter. In the front row, school board members straightened, uncertain about this deviation from the carefully curated showcase. And in the back, Edward Chambers frowned, his attention caught for the first time that evening. He'd been checking his watch repeatedly, calculating how soon he could make his donation and retreat back to his solitude. Sophie stepped onto the polished stage, the space suddenly vast and exposing. The tape on her violin caught the light, drawing more than one pitying glance. Her father watched from the shadows off stage, his hands gripping his mop handle so tightly his knuckles whitened. He hadn't been able to stop this from happening, his position too precarious, his voice too easily dismissed. "What will you be playing for us?" Mrs. Harrington asked with exaggerated politeness, the microphone amplifying the patronizing tone. Sophie swallowed. "Something I wrote," she answered softly, her voice barely audible. This drew outright laughter from a section of students, quickly hushed by teachers maintaining a pretense of decorum. The thought of the janitor's daughter not only playing but having composed something was apparently the height of absurdity. Mrs. Harrington's smile tightened. She'd expected a fumbling attempt at a simple piece, not this claim of original composition. "Very well," she said, stepping away. Sophie closed her eyes, shutting out the hundreds of faces watching her. Her fingers found their positions on the strings, the bow hovering for a moment as she gathered herself. The first note emerged tentatively, then gained confidence, a single, pure tone that seemed to hang in the air. What followed silenced every whisper in the auditorium. The melody began simply, almost like a folk song, before evolving into something complex and deeply personal. It spoke of longing, of watching beauty from a distance, of finding moments of transcendence in a life of limitations. There was no formal structure that any trained musician could identify. It obeyed no conventional rules of composition, yet its emotional authenticity was undeniable. In the back row, Edward Chambers sat perfectly still, the color draining from his face. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as though the music had physically touched him there. Mrs. Harrington's smug expression faltered, then collapsed entirely. The other teachers exchanged glances of disbelief. This was not what they had anticipated, not the humiliation they had tacitly endorsed. Instead, they were witnessing something raw and genuine that made their rehearsed performances feel suddenly hollow. Sophie swayed slightly with the music, her connection to it visceral and complete. Years of playing alone, of absorbing music through walls and doorways, of studying performances online whenever she could access the school's computers, all of it culminated in this moment of pure expression. The piece built toward its climax, Sophie's bow dancing across the strings with increasing intensity. Though her technique lacked conventional refinement, her emotional interpretation was flawless. The violin, this battered, second-hand instrument, sang with a voice that belied its humble appearance. When the final note faded, the auditorium remained suspended in silence. Sophie opened her eyes, bracing herself for ridicule, only to find hundreds of faces staring back in stunned appreciation. Then, from the back of the hall, a single person began to applaud. Edward Chambers had risen to his feet, his hands coming together in deliberate, measured claps that echoed through the space. Others joined him, hesitantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm until the applause thundered through the hall. Mrs. Harrington stepped forward, her composure shaken. "Thank you, Sophie," she said, her voice tight. "That was unexpected." But Edward Chambers was already moving down the center aisle, his security detail exchanging alarmed glances at this deviation from protocol. He reached the edge of the stage and looked up at Sophie, his expression intense. "That composition," he said, his authoritative voice carrying even without a microphone. "Where did you learn it?" Sophie clutched her violin closer. "I didn't learn it, sir. I wrote it." Edward shook his head. "Impossible." That piece, he stopped himself, aware of the attention now focused on this exchange. "May I speak with you privately?" Before Sophie could respond, James stepped out from the wings, positioning himself protectively near his daughter. "Mr. Chambers," he acknowledged, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Edward turned toward the voice and froze. The recognition that passed between the two men was instant and electric, visible to everyone watching yet comprehensible to none. "James," Edward breathed, the name emerging as though drawn from somewhere deep and long buried. The backstage area cleared with remarkable speed. Mrs. Harrington attempted to remain, citing her responsibility for the showcase, but Edward's quiet "Please give us the room" carried such authority that even she retreated, though not without a backward glance of burning curiosity. Sophie stood between the two men, her violin still in hand, confusion evident on her face. "Dad," she questioned, looking to her father for explanation. James Miller's weathered face held a complex mixture of emotions: pride, apprehension, and something that looked almost like defiance. His janitor's uniform seemed suddenly incongruous with his dignified bearing. "You know each other," Sophie stated, not a question but a realization. Edward Chambers hadn't taken his eyes off James. "We more than knew each other," he said finally. "We were brothers, once. Not by blood, but in every way that mattered." James gave a small, sad smile. "It was a lifetime ago, Sophie." "The melody," Edward continued, turning to Sophie. That piece you played. It's called Autumn Leaves Falling. I composed it when I was 23 years old. His voice softened with remembrance. I never wrote it down. Never recorded it professionally. I only ever played it for one person. Sophie looked between them, understanding beginning to dawn. Dad? James nodded. Edward and I were roommates in college. Before he was. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the wealth, the reputation, the empire that Edward Chambers had built. Before I was anything, Edward finished. When we were just two scholarship kids with second-hand instruments and big dreams. A tech reporter who had been covering the donation event had managed to remain in the shadows, her recorder running, eyes wide at the drama unfolding. This was clearly not the story she had come to write. You were more than roommates, Sophie said slowly, the pieces coming together. You were the ones who started Chambers Corps together. The dorm room startup. It's in all the company histories. She turned to her father in disbelief. You're J.T. Miller? The co-founder who disappeared. James winced at the name he hadn't heard in decades. I left before the company took off, he said simply. Left. Edward's voice hardened. Is that what we're calling it now? You disappeared. One day you were there, the next gone. No note, no forwarding address. Our code half finished, investors meetings scheduled. The controlled veneer of the billionaire philanthropist cracked, revealing decades of abandonment and betrayal underneath. I had my reasons, James replied quietly. Which were? James glanced at Sophie, then back at Edward. Your father called me to his office. Told me he'd had me investigated. Said he'd found enough in my background to ensure I'd never work in tech if I stayed with the company. His eyes held Edward steadily. He offered me $50,000 to walk away and never contact you again. Edward staggered slightly, as if physically struck. My father did that? And you believed him? You took his money instead of coming to me. I didn't take his money, James corrected. But I believed him about ruining my future. And more importantly, about ruining yours if I stayed. Sophie watched the exchange with growing understanding. All those times her father had steered her away from technology toward music instead. All those careful changes of subject when company founders were discussed. The way he never used social media or allowed his picture to be taken. What did my grandfather have on you? She asked, the question directed at her father but her eyes on Edward, watching his reaction. James looked pained. Nothing that matters now. It matters to me, Edward insisted, stepping closer. All these years, I thought you'd sold out, taken some competitor's offer. I looked for you. Hired investigators. Who wouldn't find someone who didn't want to be found, James finished for him. Especially not back then, before everything was digital. The tech reporter's thumb hovered over her phone, torn between journalistic instinct and the clearly private nature of what she was witnessing. Ethics 1, barely she put the phone away but continued to listen. Dad, Sophie pressed gently. Please tell us. James sighed deeply. Your father found out I was gay, Edward. In 1983. When it could end careers. When investors would walk. When my own family had disowned me for it. The words emerged with the weight of long silence behind them. He made it clear what would happen to both of us if it got out. Edward's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, understanding, and finally, a bone-deep anger. That bastard, he whispered. He died thinking he'd done me a favor. And you've been working as a janitor? All this time? There was no condescension in Edward's question, only pained disbelief. Not all this time, James answered. I moved around. Did whatever work I could find. Settled here about 10 years ago when Sophie was 7. He looked at his daughter with undisguised love. After her mother died. Edward absorbed this information with visible effort. Your wife knew. Maria knew everything, James confirmed. She was my best friend. She wanted a child, I wanted family that wouldn't reject me. We made our own arrangement. His expression softened with memory. It worked well for us. Sophie touched her father's arm. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? What was there to tell? James asked gently. That I could have been rich? That wouldn't have changed our lives or made things any easier. But all those times I was bullied for being the janitor's daughter. Would you rather have been bullied for being the daughter of the man who abandoned $1 billion company? James countered. For being the daughter of a man some would still condemn for who he is. Sophie had no answer for that. Edward had been watching this exchange, a new understanding dawning on his face. The composition, he said suddenly. You taught it to her? James nodded. I still played sometimes. When I could find a moment alone. Sophie must have heard me. I did, Sophie confirmed. Through the wall when I was supposed to be sleeping. It was so beautiful I'd never heard anything like it. I practiced for months to get it right. But made it your own, Edward noted. The middle section that wasn't in my original composition. Sophie blushed slightly. I added that part. It needed something more. It needed exactly what you gave it, Edward agreed, his voice gentle with wonder. You've inherited your father's gift. He turned back to James. You could have had everything, JT. Instead, you've been cleaning floors in a school that bears my name. James straightened, a quiet dignity in his bearing. I had everything that mattered. And I'm not JT anymore. Haven't been for a long time. No, Edward acknowledged. You're James Miller now. Father of an extraordinary musician. He looked back at Sophie, decision forming in his eyes. A musician who deserves every opportunity her talent merits. 6 months later, the concert hall at the newly established Miller Chambers Music Institute hummed with anticipation. The story had broken despite everyone's best efforts at discretion. Billionaire reunites with long-lost co-founder, the headlines had proclaimed, followed by increasingly sensationalized versions of events. Janitor revealed as tech pioneer. Gay tech founder driven out by homophobia returns after decades. Edward had weathered the publicity storm with practiced ease, issuing statements that revealed little while expressing his joy at reconnecting with an old and dear friend. James had refused all interviews, continuing his work at the school despite Edward's offers of more prestigious positions. I'm good at what I do, he'd insisted. There's dignity in honest work, no matter what it is. But both men had agreed on one thing: Sophie's talent deserved nurturing beyond what either of them could provide alone. Now she stood backstage at the Institute's inaugural concert, no longer in threadbare clothes but in a simple black dress that spoke of quiet elegance rather than ostentation. Her violin, not her grandmother's battered instrument but a genuine Guarneri that Edward had insisted on providing, waited in its case. Nervous? Edward asked, appearing at her side in an impeccably tailored suit. Sophie nodded, unable to find words. The audience beyond the curtain included representatives from Juilliard, Curtis Institute, and the New York Philharmonic. In 6 months, she had absorbed more formal training than most students received in years, her natural talent accelerated by access to the finest teachers money could secure. "You've earned this," Edward assured her. "Every bit of it?" "Have I?" Sophie questioned softly. "Sometimes it feels like I'm here because of who you are, not what I can do." "You're here because of who you are," came her father's voice as James joined them, still slightly uncomfortable in formal clothes but standing taller than he had in years. Freedom from secrecy had lifted something from him, restored some essence of the young man he'd once been. "The world is watching because of me," Edward acknowledged. "But they'll remember because of you. Either way," James added with gentle firmness, "you belong on that stage." Mrs. Harrington appeared, her manner toward Sophie transformed since that fateful night. Gone was the condescension, replaced by an almost obsequious deference that Sophie found more unsettling than the previous disdain. "5 minutes, Miss Miller," she said, her smile tight. She had kept her position at Lancaster Academy, but the revelation of how she had treated the daughter of the school's benefactor's former partner had permanently damaged her standing. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington," Sophie replied politely, refusing to indulge in petty triumph. As the teacher retreated, James observed, "She's still afraid she'll lose her job." "She won't," Edward assured him. "Not from any pressure from me, anyway. But she might find the newly established ethics committee takes a dim view of using students as objects of ridicule." The warning call came, and Sophie took a deep breath. "I should get ready." Both men nodded, but before they could leave, Sophie impulsively hugged her father, then, after a moment's hesitation, Edward as well. The billionaire froze momentarily, unused to such gestures, before awkwardly returning the embrace. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you." Left alone, Sophie opened her violin case and lifted the instrument, its rich wood gleaming under the lights. She remembered her grandmother's violin, now carefully restored and displayed in a place of honor at home. That humble instrument had carried her dreams when nothing else would. As the curtain rose, she faced the audience without fear. The journey from invisible janitor's daughter to recognized prodigy had happened in months, but Sophie knew the true transformation had begun years ago in quiet rooms where her father had played a billionaire's forgotten melody, in hidden moments of practice when no one was watching, in the determination to create beauty even when the world offered none in return. She began to play not Edward's composition this time, nor any classical piece from the established canon. This was something new, something entirely her own. A piece that spoke of invisibility and recognition, of secrets and revelations, of the strange twists of fate that could separate lives for decades only to bring them together again at precisely the right moment. In the audience, James and Edward sat side by side, these once young men now in their 60s, watching the next generation take flight. Between them lay decades of divergent lives, one of immense wealth and global influence, the other of honest labor and quiet anonymity. Yet as they listened to Sophie's music, the truth neither could fully articulate hung in the air between them, that both paths had led exactly here, to this moment of redemption and possibility. And in Sophie's soaring melody, there was no judgment about which path had been right or wrong, only acknowledgement that both had been necessary to create the harmony now filling the hall. What defines our worth? Is it the positions we hold, the wealth we accumulate, or something far more fundamental? Sophie's journey reveals that true value lies not in external validation but in the authenticity we bring to our lives. Her father chose integrity over fortune, principle over prominence, yet in doing so, he created space for his daughter's gift to flourish in its own time. The narrative of success typically celebrates rapid ascension, yet James Miller's story challenges us to consider a different kind of achievement, the courage to live genuinely, even when that path leads away from acclaim. Meanwhile, Edward Chambers attained everything society deems valuable, only to discover an emptiness that wealth couldn't fill. Their reconnection teaches us that reconciliation remains possible across even the widest divides of circumstance and time. That sometimes, what appears to be an ending becomes, decades later, a new beginning. That talent, like truth, eventually finds its way into the light. Perhaps most powerfully, Sophie's music reminds us that art transcends social boundaries, speaking directly to our shared humanity. Her violin became the bridge between worlds that seemed irreconcilable, between privilege and poverty, between what is given and what is earned, between the lives we plan and the lives we actually live. This story resonates because we've all felt invisible at some point, overlooked, underestimated, defined by circumstances rather than capabilities. We've all experienced moments when the world's assumptions about us clashed with our deeper truth. Share this video now with someone who needs to be seen, truly seen for who they are rather than where they come from. Tag that friend whose talent deserves recognition, that family member fighting against limitations, or that colleague whose quiet contributions go unacknowledged. Comment below about a time when you were judged by appearances rather than substance, or when an unexpected opportunity changed your trajectory. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Remember, in a world that constantly tells us our worth is measured by status and possessions, choosing authenticity is a revolutionary act. Every time you recognize the value in someone society has deemed insignificant, you help rewrite the narrative about what and who truly matters. Subscribe now to join a community that believes talent deserves recognition, regardless of its packaging. Because the next Sophie might be waiting in the wings, violin in hand, just needing someone to listen.